The stars burned bright above the shattered battlefield. Smoke still rose from the black soil where ships had fallen, and the echoes of explosions lingered in the alien air. The war had begun without warning. No one expected humans to be there. And no one expected them to fight like that. The galaxy had always spoken of Earth as a dangerous place, but very few had believed the rumors. Now, after seeing what a single human squad could do against an army, the whispers of Deathworlder spread across every camp. She had seen him first through the haze of battle. The young alien girl, barely grown by her people's measure, watched from the safety of her city's high towers as the human soldier stood alone against a machine twice his size. His armor was dented, his arm bleeding, but his eyes burned with something she had never seen before. It was not just survival, it was defiance. The kind of fire her people had lost long ago. The human raised his weapon, shouted something in his strange tongue, and the machine fell in flames. The city erupted in cheers, but she did not cheer. She only stared. Her heart pounded in her chest, not from fear but from something she did not understand. She was young, too young to name the feeling. But in that moment, she swore she would never forget the human. Later, when the fighting slowed, she found herself walking near the camp where the humans rested. She hid in the shadows, silver hair catching the moonlight, her small frame trembling with both fear and curiosity. She saw him again, his armor stripped away, his face lit by the campfire. He laughed with his comrades, a sound warm and alive, so different from the cold silence of her people. Something inside her ached to step forward, to speak, to be seen by him. But when she finally gathered the courage and revealed herself, the camp grew tense. Weapons turned in her direction until the human raised his hand and stopped them. His eyes met hers, sharp yet calm. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice steady. "I wanted to see you," she whispered, though she knew her accent was strange in his tongue. He studied her for a long moment. She was still a girl by her people's age, curious and reckless. His gaze softened, but his words were firm. "You're too young," he said quietly. "Go back. Come back when you're older." The words cut deeper than any blade. She didn't fully understand why, but tears burned her eyes. She wanted to scream that she was not a child, that she could fight, that she could stand beside him. But she saw no hesitation in his face, no cruelty, either, only a strange kind of patience, as if he knew something she did not. The next day, the war raged again. She watched from the towers as the humans pushed forward, her eyes always searching for him. When the city was saved, when the humans departed, he was gone. She was left with nothing but the echo of his voice. "You're too young. Come back when you're older." Those words haunted her. They became the fire that drove her. She trained harder than any of her peers. She studied the ways of war, of leadership, of strength. She grew with one thought alone: she would return to him. Not as a child looking up in awe, but as someone strong enough to stand by his side. Years passed. The galaxy changed. Wars came and went, but her determination did not fade. She became a warrior of her people, her name spoken with respect and sometimes fear. Yet, in the quiet of night, when the stars looked down on her, she thought only of him. The human who had fought like no other. The human who had looked at her not with disdain, but with a strange kind of care. The war that had first brought them together was long over, but another was rising. Rumors spread of new enemies in the outer systems, of planets falling one by one. Whispers said humans were fighting again, scattered across the stars. Her heart stirred with both fear and hope. If they fought again, then he would be there. Somewhere, among the countless stars, he would be waiting. And this time, she would not be a child. She would not tremble in the shadows. She would not be turned away. The girl who once wept at his words was gone. In her place stood a warrior, stronger, sharper, more determined than ever. And when she found him again, he would see her for what she had become, not too young, not too weak, but someone who had waited all her life for this moment. The years had carved strength into her, but they had not taken away the fire she carried since that first war. Her reflection in the polished steel of her armor showed a woman, now no longer the curious girl who had hidden in the shadows. Her silver hair flowed behind her like a banner, her eyes sharp and steady. She had earned her place among her people's warriors, yet inside her heart the promise still burned. She had waited. She had trained. And now, as the galaxy trembled under a new threat, she would find him again. The enemy this time was different. Not machines like before, nor simple soldiers from rival worlds. These were raiders from beyond the edge of known space, a ruthless swarm that consumed planets and enslaved survivors. They struck without warning and vanished just as quickly, leaving fire and ruin behind. Entire colonies had fallen in days. The council of her people debated endlessly, but she had no patience for hesitation. The humans, she heard, had already gone to fight. That was all she needed. Where there was war, he would be there. And if fate was kind, she would see him again. Her chance came sooner than expected. A distress call echoed through the fleet. An outer colony had been attacked. Among the names listed as defenders was one she recognized instantly. A human company was holding the line there. Her breath caught in her throat. Was it him? Was he still alive after all these years? She did not wait for orders. She volunteered for the mission, her voice steady, her gaze unflinching. The council approved, not because they cared about her personal reasons, but because they knew she was one of their finest. She boarded the warship with her squad, her heart racing as the stars blurred outside the viewport. When they arrived, the scene was chaos. Smoke rose from burning cities, the skies filled with streaks of fire as ships clashed above. Her squad descended into the heart of the battle, plasma bolts hissing past as they landed. And there he was. She saw him again through the haze of war, just as before. But this time, she was not a child looking from a distance. This time she strode into the fight as his equal. He stood in battered armor, rallying his men as enemy raiders pressed hard against their line. His face was older, rougher, marked by scars and years of war. Yet his eyes, those same eyes that had once looked at her with patience, still burned with that same fire. Her chest tightened. For years she had imagined this moment, rehearsed. The words she would say, the strength she would show. But as she watched him turn, as his gaze fell on her through the smoke, every thought fled. He froze for a heartbeat, his weapon still raised. Recognition flashed across his face, followed by something she had longed for all these years, surprise, then respect. "You," he said, his voice rough with disbelief. She lifted her blade, its edge glowing in the dim light, her stance proud. "You told me to come back when I was older," she said, her voice carrying over the clash of battle. "I have returned." For a moment, the chaos of war seemed to fall silent between them. He stared at her as if seeing a ghost, then a slow smile spread across his face. Not the laughter of campfires past, but the smile of a man who had just witnessed something extraordinary. "You kept your promise," he said softly. The enemy charged, breaking the moment. She moved first, cutting through the raiders with precision, her every strike fueled by years of determination. She fought beside him now, not behind walls, not in shadows. Blades clashed, blasters fired, and their movements flowed together, as if they had trained for this moment all their lives. He risked a glance at her between strikes. "You've changed." She met his gaze, her chest heaving, her silver hair wild in the wind. "I had to," she replied. When the last of the raiders fell, silence returned to the field. His men stood watching, whispers spreading among them. About the alien warrior who fought at their captain's side like a storm given form. She ignored the stares. Her eyes were only on him, For the first time in years, they stood face to face without smoke, without distance, without time stealing the moment away. He studied her in silence, and she held his gaze, refusing to look away. She was no longer the trembling girl who had once hidden from the soldiers' weapons. She was a warrior now, and she wanted him to see that. "You were right," she said at last. "I was too young then, but I am not anymore." He looked at her, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly he nodded. And for the first time since she had made that promise to herself, she felt the weight lift from her chest. He saw her, not as a child, not as a memory, but as someone who had fought, endured, and returned stronger. The battlefield had fallen quiet, but the war was far from over. Smoke curled upward from the ruined colony, and the cries of the wounded echoed through the streets. She stood among the human soldiers, her blade still wet from the fight, her chest heaving with exhaustion and triumph. For years she had dreamed of fighting beside him, and now she had. Yet the moment felt both unreal and incomplete. He approached her slowly, his armor scarred, his helmet tucked under one arm. The years had changed him, his face lined with hardship, his hair touched with gray, but his presence was as strong as the first time she saw him. She had feared that time would dull the fire in him, but it hadn't. If anything, it burned brighter. "You fight well," he said. His voice low. She met his eyes steadily. "I have trained for this. For you too." "See." The words slipped out before she could stop them, but she did not regret them. His expression shifted, a flicker of something unreadable passing over his face. His men pretended not to notice, though she could feel their curious glances. "Come," he said after a pause. "We have wounded to tend. The battle isn't finished yet." She followed him through the ruins, past broken walls and smoking wreckage. Together they carried the injured, set up makeshift defenses, and stood watch as the night grew cold. His men began to accept her presence, whispering less, watching her less. It was not because they trusted her fully, but because they saw the way she moved beside him, how naturally their actions aligned. That night, when the fires burned low, she found herself sitting near him outside the command shelter. The stars stretched above them, the same stars she had stared at for years while dreaming of this reunion. "You remembered me," she said quietly. He turned his head toward her, his eyes glinting in the firelight. "How could I forget? A child walking into a war camp. Brave or foolish, maybe both, but unforgettable." Her chest tightened. "I am not a child anymore." "I can see that," he said, and his tone was not dismissive. It was steady, measured, but it carried weight. "You've become strong. Stronger than most I've known." The praise should have made her feel proud, but it wasn't enough. She wanted more than his respect. She wanted his heart. But she knew such things could not be rushed. Not now, not in the middle of war. So she stayed silent, holding his words close as if they were treasures. The following days tested them both. The raiders returned in waves, pushing harder each time. She fought at his side through every assault, their movements blending seamlessly as if they shared one mind. She covered his flank when enemies tried to surround him, and he shielded her when the fire grew too heavy. Together, they became a wall the enemy could not break. His soldiers began to whisper a new story of the human captain and the alien warrior, who fought like one soul in two bodies. The men looked at her differently now, no longer as an outsider, but as part of their strength. One evening after another brutal skirmish, she collapsed against a wall, her body aching. He knelt beside her, removing her gauntlet to check her hand where a cut bled. "You push yourself too hard," he said. She looked at him, a faint smile touching her lips. "I told you I would return stronger. This is the proof." He cleaned the wound with steady hands, his touch careful, almost gentle. For a moment, time seemed to slow. Her heart raced, not from battle, but from his closeness. She wanted to tell him then that she had waited all these years, that her heart had never strayed from that promise. But his eyes carried the weight of command, of responsibility, of walls built to protect more than just himself. When he finished wrapping her hand, he met her gaze. "Strength is not only in fighting," he said softly. "It is also in knowing when to stop." She shook her head, refusing to look away. "Then let me learn that from you." Their eyes held for a long moment, before a shout from the camp broke. The silence. Scouts reported enemy movement. He rose quickly, his armor creaking, and offered his hand to help her up. She took it without hesitation, her fingers lingering against his dot as they prepared once more for battle. She realized that something had shifted. He no longer looked at her as a memory from the past. He looked at her as someone who belonged at his side. That was enough for now. But in her heart, she carried the truth she could not yet speak. She had returned for more than war. She had returned. For him. The war stretched on, each day heavier than the last. The raiders did not fight with honor or discipline. They attacked like swarms of beasts, burning everything in their path. Villages turned to ash, cities crumbled, and families fled into the wilderness. For her and the human captain, every sunrise meant another desperate defense, another test of endurance. She fought without hesitation, her blade carving through armored enemies, her movements swift and precise. The soldiers who once doubted her now followed her lead as readily as his. At night, when the wounded were tended and the dead were buried, she and the human often found themselves side by side, silent but never distant. It was during one of those nights, after a battle that nearly broke their line, that she saw the weight he carried. He sat alone by the fire, helmet at his feet, staring into the flames. His hands were steady, but his eyes were shadowed. She approached quietly and sat beside him. "You do not sleep," she said. "Too much to think about." He replied, his voice rough. She studied him, the man who had once turned her away with a patient smile, the man who now bore the burden of leading not just soldiers, but entire villages of survivors who looked to him as their shield. His strength was still there, but it was a strength strained by years of command. "You carry more than one life on your shoulders," she said softly. "No one can bear that weight forever." He turned his head toward her, his eyes catching the firelight. "Someone has to." "Then let me," she whispered. For a long moment, he said nothing. The silence stretched between them, heavy with meaning. Then he reached out, not in command, not in caution, but in gratitude. His hand brushed her shoulder, firm but warm. "You already do," he said. The words filled her with a quiet fire. It was not yet love spoken aloud, but it was something more than respect. It was recognition, and it was enough to make her heart steady even as the war grew worse. The days that followed tested them like never before. The raiders brought heavier weapons, tearing through defenses with brutal efficiency. On one night assault, their line nearly collapsed. Explosions ripped through the barricades, and soldiers fell back in panic. She stood firm, refusing to yield. When a blast sent her sprawling, it was his arms that caught her. He pulled her back to her feet, his voice a roar above the chaos. "Stand with me." Her blade flashed in the firelight as she rose beside him. Together they rallied the line, cutting through wave after wave until the enemy broke and fled. The foe. Men cheered, but she heard nothing but the pounding of her heart. She had fought at his side, shoulder to shoulder, and in his shout she heard more than command. She heard trust. Later, when the field was quiet again, she found him tending to his wounded arm. She reached for the bandages, but he shook his head. "I've survived worse," he said. She ignored him and wrapped the cloth firmly around his arm, her touch steady. "Even the strongest need care," she said. He watched her work, his expression unreadable. "You've changed," he said finally. "You are not the girl I remember." She met his eyes, her voice low. "I became the woman you told me to be." The air between them grew still. His hand moved as if to touch her cheek, but he stopped, his fingers curling instead into a fist. He pulled away, his face hardening. "This is not the time," he said. Her chest ached, but she did not argue. She knew his sense of duty was unshakable, that he would not allow himself to think of anything beyond survival. Yet she also knew he felt something he buried beneath the armor of command. The war pressed on, and so did they. With every battle, their bond deepened. When she stumbled, he was there. When he faltered, she carried him forward. The soldiers began to speak of them as one force, inseparable, a pair bound not just by war, but by something greater. And though he never said the words, she could see it in his eyes. He had waited, just as she had. The difference was that she was ready now, and one day, when the fires of war burned low, he would have no choice but to see her not as a warrior at his side, but as the one who had waited all her life to stand there. The war reached its peak with fire and steel. The raiders no longer attacked in small groups. They came in endless waves, as if determined to erase every trace of life from the colony. Day after day, the defenders fought until their bodies ached. Their eyes burned, and their armor cracked. Food grew scarce, ammunition ran low, and still the enemy pressed harder. She and the human captain stood at the center of it all. When morale faltered, they held the line. When defenses fell, they rebuilt them. And when soldiers broke under fear, they pulled them back up. To the survivors, the pair became more than warriors. They were symbols of hope, but symbols bled like anyone else. One evening, after a brutal clash that left the ground littered with enemy corpses, she found him sitting against a broken wall. His hand pressed tightly against his side. Blood seeped through the gaps in his armor. His face was pale, his jaw clenched. "You're hurt," she said, rushing to him. "It's nothing," he muttered. She dropped to her knees, pulling his hand aside to see the wound. It was deep, too deep to ignore. Her hands shook as she pressed. Cloth against it, her silver hair falling across his chest. "Do not say it is nothing," she snapped. "You bleed the same as the rest of us." His lips curved into a faint smile, even as pain clouded his eyes. "You've grown fierce." She looked at him, anger and fear burning together in her chest. "I had to. You told me to come back stronger. And now you sit here, acting as if you are made of stone." His hand rose, weak but steady, brushing her cheek. The touch was brief, but it stopped her breath. "You did come back stronger," he whispered. "Stronger than I ever thought you could be." Her heart pounded as she held the cloth tighter against his wound. "Then let me be strong for you." For a long time he said nothing. The firelight flickered over his scarred face, his eyes searching. Hers as if fighting a battle he had kept hidden for years. Finally, he sighed. "I waited," he said softly. "Not just for you to grow, but for myself to believe it could be real. I told myself there was no place for this, no place for feeling when duty demanded all of me." His gaze softened, and the fire inside it shifted from steel to warmth. "But you're here, and I can't keep pushing it away." Her hands stilled. His words struck deeper than any blade. For years she had dreamed of this moment, imagined it again and again under countless stars. Now it was real, and she felt both the weight of it and the freedom. "You made me wait," she said, her voice trembling. "And you did," he replied, a ghost of a smile tugging at his lips. "You waited, and you returned stronger. Just as I hoped you would." Her throat tightened. She wanted to speak the words she had carried for years, to pour out everything she had held inside. But before she could, a shout rang through the camp. Another wave of raiders was approaching. He pushed himself to his feet with a grunt, his wound bound tightly under her quick work. She rose beside him, her blade already drawn. Their eyes met once more, and in that look was everything they could not say aloud in front of the others. The battle that followed was the fiercest yet. The raiders came with fire and claws, but the defenders held. She fought like a storm, every strike precise, every movement fueled not only by duty, but by something stronger. He was at her side, even wounded, his commands sharp, his blade unyielding. At the height of the clash, she saw him falter, nearly struck down by a raider's blade. She leapt forward without thought, cutting the enemy down before it could land. The blow, her body shielded his, her eyes blazing as she growled, "You will not fall. Not while I still breathe." For the first time, he did not argue, did not tell her to step back. Instead, he simply nodded, his trust absolute. When the dawn finally broke, the enemy pulled back, leaving the colony in ruins but still alive, exhausted. Soldiers slumped to the ground, their cheers weak but filled with relief. She stood beside him, bloodied but unbroken, her chest heaving with breath. He turned to her then, his eyes weary but steady. "You've become everything I hoped you would be," he said. Her lips curved into a faint smile. "And you have become everything I waited for." The words hung between them, unspoken yet undeniable. Neither pressed further, for the war was not yet over. But in that moment, they both knew that something had changed. The walls he had built around his heart had begun to fall. And for the first time, she felt that when the war ended, what she had waited for might finally be within reach. The colony had endured longer than anyone believed possible, but the final storm was coming. Scouts reported that the raiders had gathered their full force for one last strike. If they broke through this time, there would be no retreat, no survivors. The humans and her people stood together on the battered walls, weapons ready, eyes hard. She stood at his side, her blade glowing faintly in the pale light of dawn. The scars on her armor told the story of every battle she had fought. His armor was the same, chipped, dented, but never surrendered. They had fought together through fire, and now they would face the end together, no matter what it brought. The enemy came like a flood. The sky darkened with ships, and the ground trembled under the march of countless warriors. The air filled with the scream of engines and the hiss of plasma fire. The defenders braced as the first wave struck, and the world erupted into chaos. Moved like lightning, her blade cutting through raiders as if they were shadows. He fought beside her, his commands sharp and steady, his presence a beacon for all around him. Together they turned the tide again and again, their movements synchronized, their strength won. But the enemy pressed harder. Siege engines roared, tearing apart defenses, and raiders poured through the gaps. The line wavered, soldiers faltered. She saw despair in their faces, and for a heartbeat, fear flickered in her chest. Then his voice rang out, "Hold the line." The soldiers rallied, their voices rising with his. His defiance was unshakable, and in that moment she understood what had drawn her to him all those years ago. It was not just his strength, it was the fire in him that refused to die, no matter how dark the night became. When the raiders broke through the last barricade, she and he stood together at the front. Their blades and rifles cut through the enemy like storms tearing through branches. The battle stretched for hours, until the ground was slick with smoke and blood. At last, as the sun broke through the clouds, the raiders faltered. Their leader fell, struck down by his hand, and the swarm began to scatter. The defenders surged forward, pushing the enemy back until the field lay quiet. Silence fell. The war was over. Exhausted soldiers dropped their weapons and sank to their knees, their cries of victory rising into the morning air. She stood beside him, her chest heaving, her armor broken, her blade heavy in her hand. He leaned against the ruins of a wall, his body trembling with fatigue. She turned to him, her eyes bright with both triumph and fear. "You live," she whispered. He looked at her, his face marked with dust and blood, and a slow, weary smile spread across his lips. "Because of you." Her throat tightened. She stepped closer, her silver hair tangled, her body aching, but her gaze never wavering. "I waited for this moment," she said softly. "For years I carried your words. I became stronger, not just for myself, but for you. Tell me it was not in vain." He stared at her, silent, his chest rising and falling with slow breaths. Then, finally, he reached out. His hand touched her face, rough and trembling but sure. "It was never in vain," he said. His voice was low, but steady. "I told you to come back when you were older. You did, and now I see you not as the child who once walked into my camp, but as the woman who stood with me through fire." Her eyes filled, but her smile was fierce. She leaned into his touch, her heart pounding as if it would break. "Then see me fully," she whispered. For a moment, the world around them faded, the soldiers cheering, the ruins smoldering, the war ending. All that remained was the human and the alien warrior who had waited for this moment across years and battles. He pulled her close, his forehead resting against hers. "You are everything I waited for too," he murmured. The fire that had carried her through years of longing finally softened into warmth. She was no longer the girl who had wept at being turned away. She was no longer the warrior fighting for recognition. She was the woman who had returned, stronger, and who now stood beside the man who had once told her to wait. Together, they looked out at the sunrise breaking over the battlefield. The war was over, but their story was only beginning, and for the first time, she felt not the ache of waiting, but the peace of being exactly where she was meant to be at his side.